Everything was orchestrated down to the last detail. The flawless wedding for my only daughter, Claire, to the man I had personally selected, the son of Boston's mayor. And who could possibly blame me? After clawing my way out of the projects in the South Bronx and single-handedly building a real estate empire, I believed my family deserved nothing but the best. But how could I ever explain that moment? The instant I stopped a plainly dressed woman at the church entrance declaring, "The seats for the general public are in the back," only to watch my future son-in-law storm towards me, his face twisted with rage, shouting, "How dare you speak to my mother that way?" In that single horrifying second, I knew I hadn't just ruined my daughter's wedding. I had detonated my entire family. Growing up in the South Bronx during the 80s taught me a fundamental truth. The world is split between those who serve and those who are served. My own mother, God rest her soul, scrubbed toilets in Park Avenue penthouses while I swore an oath to myself that one day I would be the one giving the orders. And I made good on that promise, didn't I? I built a real estate dynasty from nothing, riding the incredible property boom of the mid-2000s when cash seemed to flow like water for anyone audacious enough to seize the opportunity. But what good is a kingdom without a coronation? My Claire's marriage to the son of Boston's Mayor Sterling was meant to be that final crowning achievement. $2 million. That was the budget for the wedding. I spared no expense. Flowers flown in from Holland, a menu crafted by a 3-Michelin-star chef, a gown straight from a Parisian runway, and decor that could have been a Hollywood movie set. I controlled every single element myself. "Regina, don't you think we should hire a wedding planner?" my husband Charles had suggested. I shot him a look that could freeze fire. "And let them ruin the most important day of our daughter's life? Not a chance." The truth is, it was my day. It was my quiet revenge on every person who had ever sneered at me, on every condescending wife who gave me side-eye at the condo board meetings. Claire was my most flawless creation. I had curated every facet of her existence: the most exclusive private school in Manhattan, ballet lessons with a former Bolshoi dancer, a summer semester in Switzerland, and designer clothes since she was a toddler. She had everything I never did. When she was accepted into Johns Hopkins for pre-med, I had pushed for law at Yale naturally, so much more refined. I consoled myself with the thought, well, at least she'll meet people of a certain caliber. And it worked. I engineered our attendance at a few charity galas in the Hamptons until I managed to get her seated at the same table as Mayor Sterling's son. Philip was handsome, polished, and had a brilliant future. His maternal lineage wasn't exactly high society, a minor detail I uncovered later, but his father's surname more than compensated for it. Yet, a sense of dread haunted me in the days leading up to the wedding. I was plagued by strange nightmares where a figure would appear at the church doors, screaming that I was a fraud. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. "It's just nerves," I'd tell myself while popping another Xanax I kept hidden in my purse. I would scan the guest list for the 1,000th time, reassuring myself with the prominent names that had RSVP'd. The slightest imperfection sent me into a tailspin. The day before, I screamed at the florist because the roses were a fraction of a shade off from the color I had specified. How could I have ever known that it wouldn't be the flowers that would destroy my perfect day, but something far, far worse? Motherhood, I'll admit, was never my first calling. Claire was born just as my career was beginning to skyrocket. Someone had to raise her while I was out building our legacy, right? I hired the best nannies, and later, the best housekeepers. I vaguely recall one who stayed the longest, a quiet woman from El Salvador who could silence Claire's cries simply by picking her up. I'd come home late, exhausted from negotiations, and find her rocking my daughter, humming those soft Spanish lullabies. Something about a little white dove. I shrugged it off. At least the child was clean, fed, and quiet. When Claire turned 7, I realized it was time to start molding her. "Sit up straight, young lady. Elbows off the table. That hair of yours needs a proper cut." I enrolled her in etiquette classes at 8, piano at 9. Anything less than an A in school resulted in punishment. "Mom, the other kids are going to the park to play," she would plead, her big eyes welling up with tears. "You are not other kids, Claire. You are a Montgomery." I ignored the times I found her hiding in the housekeeper's room, listening to silly folk tales or learning how to bake a simple cake. What a colossal waste of time for someone destined for greatness. Her teenage years were a battleground. Claire insisted on wearing plain clothes, hiding the jewelry I bought her, and befriending the wrong crowd. She once took the subway, can you believe it, to attend a party at a classmate's house in Queens. I didn't speak to her for a week after that stunt. In her senior year of high school, when I announced she would be applying to Yale Law, she dropped a bombshell. "I'm going to be a doctor, Mom. I want to help people." I nearly had a stroke. Help people? And who is going to help you when you're living on the street? I fought her, threatened to cut off her allowance, but ultimately I relented. At least being a doctor carried a certain prestige, I reasoned. And maybe she'd meet a suitable husband there. That's why I almost fainted from sheer joy when 5 years later she introduced me to Philip Sterling. Finally, my plan was falling into place. The young man was perfect, handsome, well-mannered, and the son of the most powerful mayor in New England. The day they announced their engagement, I felt like I had won. It seemed Claire had finally understood her position in life. I threw them a spectacular engagement party, inviting the cream of New York society. "You see, darling," I told her, "this is the world where you belong." She just smiled, that restrained smile of hers that I could never quite decipher. If only I had known what secrets were hiding behind that smile, secrets that were about to explode right in my face. But who could have possibly guessed? I am not a woman who leaves things to chance. Long before the official family introduction dinner, I had already run a thorough background check on the Sterlings. The father, Anthony Sterling, was the sitting mayor of Boston, a successful businessman from a family with deep New England roots. The mother was my first disappointment. It turned out she wasn't a mother in the traditional sense, but a former City Hall staffer with whom he'd had an affair. The boy didn't even officially carry the Sterling surname, though everyone in their circle treated him as if he did. I swallowed hard. "It's a minor complication, nothing that can't be managed," I strategized. At the introductory dinner at Per Se, I noticed the mother's absence. "Wasn't Mrs. Sterling able to make it?" I asked with feigned innocence, pouring Anthony Sterling another glass of expensive wine. My former partner, Luisa, isn't very comfortable in these kinds of settings," he replied, shifting awkwardly in his seat. "She's a very simple woman, you know. A hard worker." A smile crept across my face as I concealed my profound relief. A simple woman who felt out of place in upscale restaurants? That was precisely the kind of person I preferred to keep at a safe distance. Across the table, Claire shot me a peculiar glance, as if she could read my very thoughts. The affection with which Philip spoke about his mother was frankly unsettling. "You wouldn't believe the trick my mom has for getting out wine stains," he remarked after Charles spilled a drop on his shirt. "She was a housekeeper for wealthy families her whole life. She knows secrets no professional cleaner has ever heard of." An icy dread washed over me. A housekeeper? I surreptitiously glanced at Claire, bracing for her reaction, but she looked utterly captivated. "I have to meet her soon, Philip. She sounds like an incredible woman." A strained smile was plastered on my face while my mind was already racing, formulating a dozen strategies to prevent that meeting at all costs. As the evening wound down, while the men were discussing city politics and Claire had stepped away, I saw my chance. "Philip, darling, could I possibly borrow your phone for a moment? My battery just died." Before he could fully process it, I had the device in my hand. Under the guise of making a quick call, I navigated to his contacts and quickly jotted down the number for Luisa. I needed to know exactly who I was up against. The next morning, using the pretense of checking references for a new hire, I dialed her number. The voice that answered was gentle, polite, with a soft, lilting accent that stirred a vague, distant memory. "And which families have you worked for previously?" I inquired, affecting the detached tone of an employer. The names she listed sent a jolt of alarm through me. Prominent New York families, some of whom moved in my own social circles. What if she recognized me at the wedding? What if she held some forgotten key to a past I had buried long ago? The thought was intolerable. A decision was made right then and there. This woman would be nowhere near that church. And so, Operation Keep Luisa Away commenced. My campaign was subtle, but relentless. Every time Philip suggested a Sunday lunch at his mother's place, I would suddenly produce an unavoidable conflict for Claire. "Oh, darling, it completely slipped my mind. We have that charity auction for the Arts Foundation. They're counting on you to be there." My daughter would narrow her eyes, her suspicion growing. "Again, Mom? This is the third unavoidable event that has landed on the same day as an invitation from Luisa." I'd simply shrug. "What can I do if our social calendar is so demanding? Once you two are married, you'll have all the time in the world." My private hope was that, by then, they'd be living on another continent. The guest list became my next strategic battlefield. "Sweetheart," I said to Philip with a syrupy voice as we reviewed the names, "we have a bit of a capacity issue at the venue. We're going to have to trim about 50 people." He looked genuinely troubled. "But we already sent save the dates to my mother's side of the family." I shook my head, feigning deep regret. "I know, it's such a shame. But how about we throw a separate party for them later? Something more intimate." The implication, thankfully, soared right over his head. Later that night, long after the house was quiet, I went through the spreadsheet and systematically deleted any surname that sounded even remotely working class. If it were up to me, that wedding would feature only the names that mattered. My daily conversations became laced with suggestions about the cultural mismatch between the families. "Philip, darling, have you two thought about where you'll live after the honeymoon? I hear London has some incredible opportunities for doctors from the States." I would plant the seed over dinner. "You're both so young, you need to see the world before settling down. Don't tie yourselves down to anything here." Charles would watch me from the corner of his eye, fully aware of my game. My husband has always been more perceptive about these things, but he never had the spine to confront me. To complete the maneuver, I hired an obscenely expensive designer to furnish a surprise gift apartment for the newlyweds on the Upper East Side, miles away from Luisa and her humble neighborhood. The most unbelievable part, Philip seemed completely oblivious. In fact, he arrived one afternoon with a massive bouquet of expensive flowers. "This is to thank you for everything you're doing to make my mother feel welcome in the family," he said, flashing that earnest smile that sent a shiver down my spine. I smiled back, feeling an unfamiliar pang in my chest. Was it guilt? Impossible. I hadn't felt guilt since 1992, when I crushed a competitor to close my first major real estate deal. "Your mother will always be welcome," I lied through my teeth. What I didn't know was that fate was about to serve me a dose of karma that perfectly matched the magnitude of my deception. And what a dose it would be. It took me too long to realize that Philip wasn't nearly as naive as I had assumed. I caught a suspicious look from him during a family lunch when I accidentally scheduled Claire's cake tasting on the same day as Luisa's birthday. "That's odd," he commented, pushing his food around his plate without any appetite. The invitations for my mom's cousins also seemed to have gotten lost in the mail. All of them. Claire, who inherited my cunning but unfortunately none of my calculated composure, flushed a deep crimson. "They must have been sent to the wrong addresses," I interjected smoothly. "The postal service has been so unreliable lately." Philip just nodded, but something behind his eyes had shifted. It was as if a curtain had been drawn. Weeks later, I walked into Claire's room without knocking and caught the tail end of a very revealing phone call. "I know, honey. I think it's strange too," my daughter was saying, clearly speaking to Philip. "Mom gets weird whenever I bring up your mother, but I just can't believe she would." She paused, listening. "That would be horrible. I'm sure it's all just a series of coincidences." When she saw me standing in the doorway, she nearly dropped her phone. "I have to go," she stammered, before facing me with a look I'd never seen before, a mixture of fear and defiance. "Is there a problem with the dress, Mom?" she asked, her voice trembling. "None at all," I replied, smiling as if I hadn't heard a thing. "Just came to remind you about dinner with the Vanderbilts tonight. Wear something elegant." I walked out, pretending that my entire castle of cards wasn't on the verge of collapse. What I didn't know then, and would only piece together much later, was that Philip had a complex history with his own background. One night, Claire came home in tears. After a great deal of prodding, I've always been terrible at consoling but excellent at interrogating, I extracted the reason. They had argued because Philip refused to invite some of his old friends to the wedding. He said a few of his college friends used to mock his mother's profession, Claire sobbed. He said he's suffered enough because of it and won't risk any malicious comments on our big day. I frowned, intrigued by this show of vulnerability. So, the perfect doctor had his own inferiority complex. This could be useful, I thought, as I gave my daughter a few mechanical pats on the back. During the week of the wedding, Philip sought me out alone, which was a rare occurrence. "Regina?" he began, taking a seat across from me in my home office as I was finalizing the seating chart. "I need to ask for something special." I raised my eyebrows, curious. "My mother, she had a minor surgery recently. Nothing serious, but she was hesitant about coming. She finally confirmed she'll be there." An automatic, brilliant smile spread across my face, a perfect mask for the sheer panic erupting inside me. "How wonderful," I lied. "We've saved a special place for her, of course." He held my gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable, as if trying to peer directly into my soul. "Thank you. It's incredibly important to me that she's treated with respect. You know, she was both a mother and a father to me. She scrubbed floors on her hands and knees her entire life just to give me a chance." I swallowed hard against a suddenly dry throat, feeling a bead of cold sweat trace a path down my spine. "Of course, Philip," I murmured. "It will be an honor to have her." The day I had meticulously engineered finally arrived, May 17th, 2023. It was an autumn Wednesday, blessed with a sky of impossible, cloudless blue. I had paid a small fortune for a bespoke meteorological consultation and would have accepted nothing less than perfection. St. Patrick's Cathedral on Fifth Avenue was a breathtaking spectacle, practically dripping with the orchids I'd had flown in from Amsterdam. A procession of Blacktown cars and foreign luxury vehicles idled outside, depositing the crème de la crème of New York society onto the sidewalk. I stood near the entrance, a statue of impeccable taste in a custom Carolina Herrera gown the color of a stormy sea, which had cost the equivalent of a down payment on a Manhattan studio. My official purpose, according to the naive event planners, was to greet guests. My actual purpose was to be a velvet-gloved warden, controlling the flow of people, especially now that Philip had confirmed his mother's attendance. "Regina, this is absurd," Charles whispered, shifting uncomfortably beside me. "Did you really hire 3 extra security guards just to check invitations?" A dismissive smile touched my lips. "Would you prefer some random tourist wandering in and ruining the photographs, Charles? You've always been so naive." He retreated, as he always did when we disagreed. It was for the best. I was far too busy air-kissing the mayor of New York and his wife to be bothered with my husband's trivial anxieties. That's when I saw her. She was ascending the grand cathedral steps alone, a small, slender woman with graying hair pulled back in a simple bun. She wore a modest, light blue dress that was clean but clearly inexpensive, and clutched a synthetic handbag. Her low-heeled shoes had seen better days. Every internal alarm I possessed began to shriek. "Excuse me, may I see your invitation?" I intercepted her just before she could cross the threshold, physically blocking her path with my jewel-adorned body. She looked up at me, and in her dark, gentle eyes, I saw a flicker of something I couldn't quite place. "I'm the groom's mother," she answered in a low voice that carried that same soft, lilting accent that so unnerved me. "Luisa." I scanned her from head to toe, a wave of mingled relief and contempt washing over me. She was exactly what I had feared, a common domestic worker who would be a blemish on the flawless aesthetic of my masterpiece event. "I'm not seeing your name on the list," I lied, pretending to scroll through a list on my phone. "And in any case, the seating for general guests is in the rear pews. We need to keep the front clear for the family photographs." The words were launched like poison-tipped darts. She didn't react as I'd anticipated. There was no outrage, no tears, no dramatic scene. Just a long, quiet gaze that seemed to penetrate my carefully constructed facade and see every secret I kept hidden. "I understand," was all she said, before turning and walking with her head held high toward the very last row of the cavernous church. Something about that silent dignity rattled me more than any outburst could have. I returned to my post, a bitter taste in my mouth despite the success of my little cruelty. The people nearby politely pretended they hadn't witnessed the exchange, though I caught a few sideways glances of disapproval, quickly smothered by effusive compliments about the decor and my dress. The ceremony was about to begin, yet I felt a strange disquiet, as if I had prodded a sleeping dragon. If I had known what was coming in the next few minutes, I would have fled that cathedral and never looked back. The organ music began to swell, as majestic as I had demanded. Claire was a vision in her $200,000 gown, walking down the aisle on the arm of Charles, who, for once, looked genuinely proud without any coaching from me. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. Everything was proceeding according to my script. Philip waited at the altar, devastatingly handsome in the Italian suit I had personally selected. "A gift from your mother-in-law," I'd insisted when he tried to refuse. I could already envision the multi-page spread in Vogue weddings, my name whispered with envy in the city's most exclusive salons. After decades of clawing my way up New York's treacherous social ladder, I had finally reached the summit, or so I believed. As the ceremony progressed, I noticed something was off. Philip's gaze kept darting towards the back of the cathedral, his brow furrowed as if searching for someone. I followed his line of sight, and my blood ran cold. He had found his mother, sitting alone in the last pew. It was like watching a car crash in slow motion. First, recognition dawned in his eyes. It was followed by confusion. And then came something that terrified me, a cold fury that transformed his handsome features into the mask of an executioner. The priest droned on about love and union, oblivious to the tempest brewing before him. "Father, if you'll excuse me for one moment." Philip's voice cut through the sermon, slicing through the sacred silence of the church. The entire congregation stirred. Claire looked at him, bewildered. Without another word of explanation, he descended the altar steps and strode purposefully down the central aisle. Straight to the back row. Straight to his mother. My entire body went rigid. "Mom, what are you doing sitting all the way back here?" His voice, amplified by the cathedral's perfect acoustics, reached every corner. Luisa whispered something inaudible in response. As she spoke, I watched Philip's face morph until he turned slowly to face me, his eyes blazing with a controlled rage that made me want to shrink away. "How dare you speak to my mother that way?" The words detonated in the stillness as he walked back up the aisle, now holding Luisa's hand. The heads of 500 guests swiveled back and forth as if watching a particularly vicious tennis match. Claire, still standing at the altar, looked as though she'd been struck. "What is he talking about, Mother?" she asked, her voice trembling. I attempted a breezy laugh that came out as a strangled croak. "It must be a misunderstanding, darling. I simply suggested she might be more comfortable." Philip cut me off. "Don't you dare lie. My mother just told me your exact words. The seating for general guests is in the rear. We need to keep the front clear for the photographs." The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was a vacuum, sucking all the air and warmth out of the cathedral. I, the master controller, had lost control of everything in real time, in front of a captive audience of the very society I had spent my life desperate to conquer. "I want everyone here to meet my mother," Philip announced, his voice ringing with conviction as he led Luisa to the front of the altar. She looked overwhelmed by the sudden spotlight, but maintained the same dignified posture that had unsettled me earlier. "This is Luisa, the woman who sold the only home she ever owned to put me through medical school. The woman who worked 3 cleaning jobs at a time so I could afford my textbooks. The woman I respect more than anyone on this earth. A woman who, apparently, wasn't good enough to sit in the front row at her own son's wedding." Every single word was a perfectly aimed stone, shattering the glass house of my reputation. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Eleanor Vanderbilt, the matriarch of one of New York's oldest families, whispering to her daughter behind a gloved hand, a cruel little smile playing on her lips. Claire stumbled down from the altar, her eyes wide with a horrified understanding. "Philip, is that your mother? The woman Mom said didn't want to come to the wedding?" I felt the blood drain from my face. "I never said that," I protested, but the denial sounded flimsy even to my own ears. Philip held up his phone, the screen glowing like a damning piece of evidence. "Then why do I have 5 confirmation emails for my family's invitations that were never actually delivered? Why did another unavoidable commitment for Claire miraculously appear every single time I tried to arrange a lunch with my mother? He turned to Luisa. Did you ever receive an official invitation to your only son's wedding? She just shook her head, a silent, powerful negation. I could feel the stares of 500 people burning into me like lasers. Charles, who had been a silent statue until now, took a step forward. Regina, did you really do this? The raw disappointment in his voice was unbearable. For 30 years of marriage, he had swallowed my ambitions, my questionable methods, my casual cruelties, always looking the other way in the name of a peaceful life. But the man staring at me now was a stranger, and he clearly despised what he was seeing for the first time. I opened my mouth to defend myself, to weave some plausible excuse, but all that escaped was a pathetic, choked sound. The empire of lies I had so carefully constructed was crumbling like a sandcastle against the tide. It wasn't supposed to be like this, I managed to whisper, tears of pure humiliation welling in my eyes. Claire approached Luisa as hesitant as a small child, and then something strange happened. A look of confused recognition flickered across my daughter's face. Do I know you from somewhere?" she asked, her brow furrowed in the same way it did when she was trying to solve a difficult diagnosis. Luisa offered a gentle, sad smile that seemed to hold decades of untold stories. "Perhaps, my dear," she answered softly. "Perhaps." It was in that exact instant that the memory hit me, a flash of lightning in the storm of my mind. Those same dark, gentle eyes, only younger, cradling my newborn daughter as I rushed out the door to an important meeting. A chill snaked its way down my spine. It couldn't be. Fate would not be so cruel, so poetically, perversely vengeful. Or would it? Time seemed to bend and warp, stretching the terrible moment into an eternity. I forced myself to truly look at Luisa, not as the groom's inconvenient mother, but as a person. The simple bun holding back hair that was now streaked with gray, but had once been as black as night. The small, calloused hands, clutching a cheap purse with the same poise another might hold a Birkin bag. And above all, those eyes. Eyes I now knew. Eyes that had haunted my recent nightmares without me ever understanding why. "You," I began, my voice cracking. "You worked in my home?" A pin-drop silence fell over the cathedral. Even the priest, who had been desperately trying to regain some semblance of control, was now speechless. Luisa met my gaze directly, without fear or anger, only a quiet certainty. "For 15 years, Regina, from 1995 to 2010. I looked after Claire from the day she was born until the day you fired me." The words landed like hammer blows. 15 years? Impossible. How could I not have recognized her? But I already knew the answer. I had never truly seen her. I only ever saw the uniform, a faceless functionary who moved through my house, handling all the things I deemed beneath my notice, which, I now realized, often included my own child. Claire staggered back as if she'd been physically struck. "Lulu? My Lulu?" Her voice was a strangled, childlike whisper. And then I witnessed the impossible. My daughter, my perfect, poised, European-educated Claire, sank to her knees before this simple woman, wrapping her in a desperate, clinging embrace. "I remember now. You used to sing to me when I had nightmares. You made chocolate chip cookies when I got a good grade. You were the one who taught me how to tie my shoes, how to braid my hair." Sobs racked her body, ruining the flawless makeup, creasing the $200,000 gown, but she didn't seem to care. "Why did you leave? Why did you never come back to see me?" Philip looked from his mother to Claire, stunned by this unbelievable connection. "Mom, you worked in their house? You knew Claire when she was a little girl?" Luisa nodded slowly, silent tears finally tracing paths down a face weathered by time and hard work. "Yes, my son. I rocked her to sleep many nights. I cared for her as if she were my own." Her eyes found mine across the space, and for the first time I saw an accusation in them. "Until the day I found out you had gotten into medical school. I came home so proud, I wanted to tell the whole world." She swallowed hard. "The next day, Regina called me into the library. She told me my services were no longer required. She didn't even let me say goodbye to the little girl." The murmuring in the church rose to a roar. I saw Eleanor Vanderbilt poking another socialite, discreetly pointing in my direction, her face alight with undisguised pleasure at my downfall. Charles looked at me as if I were a monster. But the worst was the look in Claire's eyes, my own daughter's, filled with a pain and betrayal that cut deeper than any knife. Luisa, however, maintained that infuriating calm. She began to speak, and her soft voice carried through the cathedral, silencing even the most distant whispers. I came to New York in 1995, 7 months pregnant, after my husband died in a construction accident back home in El Salvador. I desperately needed work. Regina hired me, even with my big belly, because I agreed to a lower wage. A sharp pang of shame shot through me. I had completely forgotten that sordid detail. Philip was born in the staff quarters in the basement of the Montgomery townhouse during a thunderstorm. Regina wasn't even in the country. She had gone on a shopping trip to Miami. The horrified gasps from the pews made me wish the marble floor would open up and swallow me whole. Had I really left an employee to give birth alone in my basement while I was buying handbags? I raised them almost as twins, she continued, her gaze shifting between Philip and Claire. My son would stay with me in the basement during the day, while I cleaned the house and cared for little Claire. At night, long after everyone else was asleep, I would study from the old textbooks I found in the trash bins at the community college nearby. Philip never took his eyes off his mother. He looked as if he were hearing parts of this story for the very first time. When Philip was 6 years old, I managed to get him a spot in a decent public school in our borough. I'd leave before any of you were awake, walk him to the school gates, and then rush back on the subway to have your family's breakfast ready. She looked at Claire with a tender expression. You always used to ask where I was going so early, remember? I would tell you I was going out to get fresh bagels for you. The years of her devotion unfolded in her simple, devastating words. The nights she stayed up when Claire had a fever. The birthday parties she organized while I merely signed the checks and showed up for the photographs. The scraped knees she bandaged, the bedtime stories she read, the homework she helped with. Philip grew up studying in that basement room while I was ironing your clothes or cooking your dinner. Sometimes, when no one was looking, Claire would sneak down there and the two of them would play together. This revelation sent audible gasps through the pews. My socialite daughter had been secretly playing with the housekeeper's son? They loved to pretend they were doctors, Luisa continued, a sad smile touching her lips. They would operate on every doll and stuffed animal in the house. When Philip earned a full scholarship to Bronx Science because of his perfect grades, it was the happiest day of my life. I started working even harder, taking on extra cleaning jobs on weekends, mending clothes late into the night, just to afford the books and supplies the scholarship didn't cover. For the first time, her voice wavered. And when he got his acceptance letter, with a full ride to Columbia Medical School, she paused, took a deep breath, and locked her eyes onto mine. That was the day you called me into the library, Regina. Do you remember what you told me? I swallowed, my throat constricting with panic. Of course I remembered. How could anyone forget an act of such gratuitous cruelty? You said, now that your son is going to be a doctor, it's probably best you find a position elsewhere. I don't want that sort of complication in my home. And I trust you'll remember the terms of your non-disclosure agreement. No! Claire's shriek reverberated off the century-old stone walls of the cathedral. You couldn't have done that, Mother. You couldn't. She scrambled to her feet, her face a mess of tears and smeared mascara, a horrifying parody of the flawless bride I had created. Lulu was more of a mother to me than you ever were. When you were away on business trips for weeks, when you locked yourself in that office until midnight, she was the one who held me, who brushed my hair, who knew what I loved and what I was afraid of. Each word was a spear thrown directly at my heart, a public exposition of a truth I'd always known but refused to acknowledge. I had outsourced motherhood. The memories were now flooding back to Claire in a torrent. Now I understand why you just vanished overnight. I was what, 15? I came home from school one day and you were gone. When I asked Mom where you were, she said you had quit, that you'd found a better job. She whirled to face me, her eyes blazing with a righteous fury. You lied! I cried for weeks. I thought Lulu didn't love me anymore, that I had done something wrong to make you leave. The guilt was suffocating me. I had, in fact, told my daughter that Luisa had simply moved on, that people like that were unreliable. It was a calculated cruelty designed to shut down any further questions. Philip, who had been watching this all unfold in stunned silence, finally found his voice. My mother came home that day completely broken. I didn't understand it at the time. She just kept saying that she'd lost more than a job. She'd lost a child she loved. He looked at Claire, seeing her in a completely new light. You were the little girl from all her stories, the one with the one-eyed teddy bear named Samson, who would only eat her carrots with ranch dressing, who was terrified of thunderstorms. Claire let out a gut-wrenching sob. I still have Samson. I still eat my carrots with ranch. I still hide in my closet during a storm. It was as if two halves of a fractured photograph had finally been pieced together, revealing an image that had been there all along. In the front row, Charles finally shed his lifelong passivity. How could you, Regina? Separate them like that? Lie for all these years? And then to try and humiliate this woman on their wedding day? His usually placid voice trembled with indignation. Suddenly, I was utterly alone, surrounded by an impromptu tribunal in the very cathedral that was meant to be the stage for my greatest triumph. Claire knelt again before Luisa, clutching her hands as if they were a lifeline. Can you forgive me for forgetting you? For not looking for you? For believing my mother's lies? Luisa stroked her hair, just as she had when Claire was a child. There is nothing to forgive, my flower. You were just a little girl. The priest, utterly lost, cleared his throat. Perhaps we could resume the ceremony? Or postpone for another day? The suggestion hung in the air like a grotesque joke. Claire rose slowly to her feet. Her designer gown was wrinkled, her makeup was ruined, but her eyes held a steely resolve I had never seen before. There will be no wedding today, at least not the one my mother planned. She looked around the cathedral, at the important guests, the priceless flowers, the entire opulent spectacle I had orchestrated. This is all false, just as false as the way we have treated the mother of the man I love. Philip moved to her side, wrapping an arm around her waist, his expression a mixture of pain and profound relief. Are you sure? Claire nodded. Completely. I refuse to start our life together built on a foundation of cruelty and lies. She turned to face the astonished congregation. I apologize to all of you who came here today. The wedding is canceled. A shocked murmur filled the church. I started to step forward, panicked. Claire, don't be ridiculous. All of this over a house. Charles grabbed my arm, his grip like iron, silencing me with a look of utter finality I had not seen in 30 years of marriage. Enough, Regina. You've done enough damage. Then, to my absolute horror, my husband walked over to Luisa and did the unthinkable. He apologized. I am so sorry for what my wife has done, and I am even sorrier that I never intervened, that I turned a blind eye to the way she treated you and the other staff. His eyes were wet with tears. Charles, whom I had never seen cry, not even at his own father's funeral. And thank you for taking such good care of our daughter when we both failed her. Luisa, with that infuriating dignity that seemed to be her armor, simply nodded in silent acceptance. Claire took the microphone from the stunned priest's hand. I want everyone to know the truth. This woman, Luisa, raised me like a mother for 15 years. And by some terrible coincidence, or perhaps proof that fate has a twisted sense of humor, I fell in love with her son, never knowing who he was. Tears streamed freely down her face, but her voice was strong. There will be no reception today, but for anyone who would like to join us, Philip and I are going to take Luisa to have lunch at Tavern on the Green, a restaurant she has always dreamed of seeing. She smiled through her tears at the woman who raised her. What was its name again, Lulu? That Italian place you used to see in Mom's magazines? I remained frozen, a marble statue of my own ruin, as I witnessed the unthinkable. My daughter, my husband, and every single one of my guests were slowly, deliberately, emptying the cathedral. Not even in my most terrifying nightmares could I have conjured a humiliation this absolute. Tavern on the Green, Luisa's voice answered Claire's question. The one in Central Park. You always used to say it was the most beautiful restaurant in all of New York. My own housekeeper knew my supposed favorite places better than I did. Claire smiled in a way I hadn't seen since she was a little girl, a genuine, unburdened smile, free of the tension I had so carefully instilled in her. "Regina, I'm going with them," Charles announced, his voice flat, his gaze fixed somewhere over my shoulder. "Don't wait up." And with that, he was gone, leaving me utterly alone, save for a few stragglers who lingered not out of solidarity, but for the morbid pleasure of watching me fall. Among them, of course, was Eleanor Vanderbilt and her clique of blue-blooded socialites. She glided towards me, her smile as thin and sharp as a razor's edge. "What a truly unfortunate situation, Regina, my dear. But you know what we say in old New York families? New money can buy a townhouse on Park Avenue, a fleet of foreign cars, even a spot on the board of the Met, but it can't buy class." I felt the blood rush to my face, a hot flush of shame. "Go to hell, Eleanor," I managed to rasp, but she only laughed, a light, tinkling sound that was more cruel than any shout. They say pride comes before the fall, don't they? But in your case, dear, the fall came with a touch of divine irony. She adjusted her ludicrously expensive hat and leaned in, whispering so only I could hear. "You people never learn how to behave. You confuse net worth with self-worth. You poor thing. Deep down, you're still just that scared little girl from the South Bronx, playing dress-up in a world you'll never belong to." The blow landed with surgical precision. How did she know? Who had told her about the origins I had spent a lifetime burying? As the last of the guests departed, I stood there, my Carolina Herrera gown now feeling like a ridiculous costume. The embarrassed priest began quietly packing his things. The photographers I'd hired packed their equipment, refusing to meet my eye. The choir was silent. The $2 million in flowers now seemed like a grotesque, wilting monument to my failure. $2 million, I whispered to the cavernous, empty space, thrown away. It was only then I realized it wasn't the money that hurt. It was the complete and utter annihilation of the life I had built. I fled the cathedral through a side door, avoiding the cameras and gawkers still clustered at the main entrance. My driver, the only person who hadn't abandoned me, drove me in profound silence back to the empty penthouse. I collapsed onto the Italian leather sofa, still in my wedding attire, and did something I hadn't done in 30 years. I wept. I cried uncontrollably, not for the lost status or the public disgrace, but because for the first time I could clearly see the monster I had become. And the most terrifying part was having no idea how to go back, how to fix what I had broken, or if something so shattered could ever be mended at all. My phone buzzed incessantly, gossip columnists from Page 6, no doubt, or friends hungry for sordid details. I turned it off and surrendered to the encroaching darkness of the apartment as night fell over New York City and over the smoldering ruins of my life. 3 days passed in a blur of Xanax and single malt scotch. I hadn't heard a word from Charles or Claire. The media was merciless. Someone had filmed the entire cathedral scene, and the video had gone viral. Socialite humiliates groom's mother, discovers she was her own daughter's nanny. I stopped answering the phone, drew the blackout curtains, and hid from the world, fantasizing about moving to a country where no one knew my name. Then, the doorbell rang, insistent and sharp. It was Philip, alone. I stood frozen in the doorway for a long moment, unsure how to react. He looked just as uncomfortable, but there was a resolve in his eyes. "May I come in, Regina?" he asked, his tone still maddeningly formal. I stepped aside, a strange cocktail of fear and relief swirling inside me. Someone was still willing to speak to me, even if it was the man whose mother I had publicly destroyed. He declined my offer of coffee or water, perching on the edge of the sofa as if he didn't intend to stay long. "I'm here because Claire asked me to be," he began, getting straight to the point. "She's hurt, deeply, but she thinks you deserve to know a few things." He took a deep breath, like a diver preparing to plunge into icy water. "You weren't the only one hiding things, ashamed of where you came from." His hands twisted in his lap. "Throughout my entire time at Columbia, I worked nights as a valet at a garage downtown to supplement my scholarship. When I started dating Claire, I told her I was working extra shifts at the hospital." The confession stunned me. The flawless Dr. Philip Sterling had his own insecurities. On nights when our wealthy friends would go out, I'd make up excuses because I didn't have the right clothes or the money to chip in for bottle service. His gaze met mine, direct and unwavering. There were times I was ashamed of my mother, ashamed to admit she was a housekeeper, ashamed of her accent, ashamed when she'd show up on campus with her hands raw from cleaning chemicals. A single tear escaped, and he swiped it away impatiently. And that is the single greatest regret of my life. Because while I was getting a world-class education, she was sometimes eating leftover food from her employer's plates to save money. While I was in a prestigious residency program, she was sleeping 4 hours a night to get to all her jobs on time. He stood up, too agitated to remain seated. So I understand you, Regina. I understand you better than you can possibly imagine. That fear of not belonging, of being found out as an imposter, of never being good enough. His words struck a deeply buried chord within me. But do you know the difference between us? I realized I was betraying the one person who had never betrayed me, and I chose to stop. He picked up his coat, ready to leave. Claire and I are still getting married. A small ceremony with only the people who truly matter. And we're staying here, in New York. We're going to work at a public city hospital, not move to London like you wanted. At the door, he turned back one last time. My mother once told me something I'll never forget. Son, it doesn't matter how high you climb. The moment you step on the people who lifted you up, you've already fallen to the bottom. The weeks that followed were a slow-motion nightmare. The most important investors in my real estate firm began pulling out of deals, citing a sudden incompatibility of values. The building's condo board sent a discreet email informing me that several residents had expressed discomfort with my presence in the common areas. Lifelong friends suddenly stopped returning my calls. Charles didn't even have the decency to show up himself. He sent a lawyer to inform me that he was moving to the Hamptons house for the foreseeable future, and that he needed time to reevaluate our marriage. The life I had spent decades assembling was being blown away like a house of cards in a hurricane. At first, I clung to rage as if it were a life raft. What I did wasn't that unforgivable, I would tell my reflection in the mirror, polishing off another bottle of expensive Chardonnay. How many women on Park Avenue do far worse to their staff every single day? This is a witch hunt, fueled by jealousy. My executive assistant resigned via email. The housekeeper simply stopped showing up. The delivery services started leaving groceries with the doorman, refusing to come up to the penthouse. I rationalized it all. A pack of hypocrites. If this were Eleanor Vanderbilt, they'd all be lining up to kiss her feet. My public disgrace became the nation's new favorite binge watch. There were memes, TikTok psychoanalyzing my every move, and think pieces dissecting my problematic behavior. One self-proclaimed expert posted a viral video diagnosing me with textbook narcissistic personality disorder. Former acquaintances gave interviews recounting tales of my arrogance at past galas, most of which were either wildly exaggerated or entirely fabricated. But the killing blow came when the tabloids unearthed my past. Socialite who shamed housekeeper is the daughter of a cleaning lady, one headline screamed. The irony was so vicious, it felt like a plot from a trashy daytime soap opera. The loneliness became a physical presence, a crushing weight in the silent, empty apartment. My once-packed social calendar was now a blank page. The only calls I received were from reporters digging for more dirt or from brands terminating our partnerships. On one particularly bleak afternoon, I found myself staring over the edge of my penthouse terrace, the wind whipping at my clothes, when the phone rang for the 20th time. I was about to ignore it, but some instinct made me answer. It was an unfamiliar woman's voice, calm and professional. "Am I speaking with Mrs. Montgomery? This is the charge nurse at Mount Sinai. You need to come to the hospital immediately. Your husband has had a minor stroke." The world tilted on its axis. Charles, my anchor for 30 years, for all his passivity. "I'm on my way," I said, my voice a mechanical rasp as I splashed water on my face and fumbled for my car keys. Something deep inside me, a tiny dormant thing, began to stir. Was it guilt? Remorse? Or was it just the primal fear of losing the very last pillar holding up the ruins of my life? I drove to the hospital like a madwoman, the first time I'd been behind the wheel myself in years. My driver had quit along with the rest of the staff. I navigated the chaos of Manhattan traffic with a frantic energy, and finding parking near Mount Sinai on a Saturday afternoon was a fresh kind of hell. I ended up 3 blocks away, stumbling along the sidewalk in heels not designed for haste or desperation. At the admissions desk, the clerk's eyes widened in recognition when I gave my name. "Ah, Mrs. Montgomery, room 507, the private pavilion." Her expression was a perfect cocktail of morbid curiosity and contempt, a look that had become my constant shadow. Charles was asleep, tethered to machines that beeped a steady, rhythmic tune. He looked smaller in the hospital bed, fragile and suddenly old. A young resident explained that the stroke had been mild, with no apparent long-term damage, but it was a serious warning sign. His blood pressure was through the roof, ma'am, likely brought on by prolonged, extreme stress. He didn't have to say another word. The accusation hung in the sterile air. I sank into the visitor's chair, just watching the face of the man who had shared my life for 3 decades. When was the last time I had truly looked at him? When had I ever considered what he wanted, what he felt? When a nurse came in to check his vitals, her kindness was jarring. She offered me coffee, patiently explained each procedure, and asked if I was comfortable. She was a middle-aged woman with graying hair in a neat bun, her small, efficient hands moving with a practiced grace. "You need to get some rest, too," she said, handing me a soft blanket. "Can I get you some tea?" I nodded, bewildered by this humane treatment when I had braced myself for more scorn. It was only when she returned that I noticed her name tag. Sarah Evans, RN, 25 years of service. "You don't recognize me, do you?" she asked, her smile gentle but tinged with sadness. I frowned, my mind racing to place her face. "I worked in your home for 2 months back in 2003. I was filling in for your regular housekeeper who was out on medical leave." A cold dread trickled down my spine. Was this another ghost from my past, returned to haunt me? "I'm sorry, I don't recall," I stammered, bracing for another public indictment. But she just nodded. "That's all right. We were invisible to employers like you." There was no bitterness in her voice, only the quiet statement of a fact. "And you're still helping me? Being kind to me after everything that's happened?" The question was genuine, torn from a place of utter confusion. She checked the IV drip attached to Charles's arm before she answered. "You know, Mrs. Montgomery, my life has taught me that returning cruelty with cruelty only puts more of it into the world. And from what I can see in your eyes, you're already facing a punishment far greater than any I could ever give." Her words were a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. She continued, straightening his sheets. "Besides, I was here when they brought your husband into the ER. In the middle of his delirium, he kept saying your name. Despite everything, he's still worried about you." She left the room, leaving me alone with an invisible mirror I could no longer avoid, the true, monstrous reflection of the woman I had become. For 3 days I lived in that hospital, sleeping in the unforgiving armchair, surviving on stale sandwiches from the basement cafe, and wearing the same clothes because I couldn't bear the thought of returning to the silent penthouse. Charles drifted between long stretches of sleep and moments of hazy consciousness. We spoke, but only in abstracts: the weather, the hospital food, the noisy monitors. We never spoke of Claire, or the wedding, or the wreckage of our own marriage. It was like we were both standing on the edge of a cliff, pretending not to notice the 1,000-foot drop at our feet. On the 4th night, after visiting hours had ended and the hospital settled into that eerie nocturnal quiet, broken only by the occasional beep of a machine, I had a terrible nightmare. I was a child again, no older than 7, trailing my mother into a vast, sunlit penthouse where she worked. The woman of the house, dripping with jewels, looked down at me with an expression of pure disgust. "Maria, I've told you before. I don't want the staff's children in my home." My mother, humiliated, apologized profusely, promising I would be silent in a corner. The elegant woman then turned her cold eyes on me. "People like you will never belong in this world. You will never be one of us." And she laughed, a cruel, sharp sound that echoed and swelled until I woke up gasping, my body drenched in a cold sweat, the hospital room disorientingly dark. It wasn't a dream. It was a memory. one I had buried so deep in the foundations of my life that I had forgotten its existence. Sarah, the night nurse, was by my side, her hand a steady weight on my shoulder. "You were screaming," she explained, her voice laced with concern. "Are you all right?" I shook my head, unable to form words. An uncontrollable tremor seized my body. "I think I'm having an attack," I managed to choke out between ragged breaths. My heart was a frantic bird beating against my ribs, desperate to escape. Sarah was a whirlwind of calm efficiency, calling the on-call resident who, after a series of checks, diagnosed a severe panic attack. "Your body is having a physical reaction to prolonged psychological stress, Mrs. Montgomery," he said, administering a sedative directly into my IV. "I strongly recommend you seek professional help as soon as possible." When we were alone again, Sarah sat with me in the quiet darkness. "Do you want to talk about the nightmare?" she asked softly. Before I could stop them, the words poured out of me. I remembered something from when I was a child, something I buried for 40 years, and I told her, a virtual stranger who had shown me more compassion than anyone in my gilded social circle, about the searing humiliation of being the maid's daughter, about the silent vow I made to myself that day to never, ever feel that shame again, and the most horrific realization of all, that I had spent my life becoming the very monster who had traumatized that little girl so long ago. Charles was discharged the following week. To my utter surprise, he chose to come back to the penthouse instead of retreating to the Hamptons. "We need to talk, Regina," he said, his voice still frail but firm. "We can't keep pretending the ground hasn't collapsed beneath our feet." It was the most honest conversation we'd had in 30 years of marriage. He spoke of his own complacency, of how he had turned a blind eye to my cruelties for so long that he had become an accomplice. "I never truly stood up to you. It was always easier to bury myself in work, to pretend I didn't see." I wept like a child when he finally admitted, "I think I stopped loving the woman you became a long time ago, Regina. But in the process, I also stopped respecting myself." That same week, I called the number Sarah, the nurse, had given me. Dr. Ann Shapiro, a therapist specializing in trauma. In our first session, I could barely speak, oscillating between convulsive sobbing and long, ashamed silences. In the second, I began to excavate memories I didn't know I had. My mother coming home, bone-tired, but still finding the energy to help me with my homework. The cruel taunts from classmates about my secondhand clothes. The shame of living in a cramped tenement building in the South Bronx while attending a magnet school on a partial scholarship, surrounded by the children of doctors and lawyers. "Mrs. Montgomery, Doctor," Shapiro said after our third session, "you've spent your entire life building a fortress around the ghost of a wounded child. But she is still in there, screaming to be heard." I began writing letters. Letters I knew I would never have the courage to send. To Claire, I wrote about the rare, fleeting moments of genuine connection we'd shared, admitting how my own fear of not being good enough had twisted me into a cold, controlling parent. To Charles, I wrote my thanks for his decades of patience and my apology for a lifetime of manipulation. And then, the hardest letter of all, to Luisa. In it, I poured out everything. The irrational fear that had gripped me when I learned her son was becoming a doctor. The calculated cruelty of firing her without a goodbye, and finally, the absolute, soul-crushing shame of my actions at the church. "I became the monster I feared most," I wrote, the ink bleeding from the tears that fell on the page. One morning, on a sudden, desperate impulse, I got in my car and drove to the South Bronx, the place I had fled like a plague. The neighborhood had changed, yet it was achingly the same. I parked near my old elementary school and just watched the children playing in the yard. One little girl, with bright eyes and a fearless grin, stared back at me, likely wondering about the strange, sad woman in the expensive car. I offered her a small, hesitant smile, and she smiled back, a smile with no judgment, no calculation, no agenda, the kind of smile I had forgotten how to give. I drove home with an unfamiliar feeling of lightness, as if I had found a piece of myself I thought was lost forever. 3 months passed. Charles and I were polite roommates, sharing a vast, silent space. The business was on the verge of collapse. Perhaps it's time to liquidate, my accountant advised gently. Your personal assets are more than enough to live comfortably for the rest of your life, even if we sell at a loss. It was on a rainy Tuesday that news of Claire finally reached me. It didn't come from her. She still wasn't answering my calls. It came through the city's informal intelligence network from my former manicurist Maria, who had heard it from her cousin who does the hair for one of Claire's friends from med school. Mrs. Montgomery, I don't know if I should be telling you this, but, she began, her voice hesitant. Your daughter, she's 2 months pregnant. It's going to be a boy. The world, which had been spinning out of control, suddenly stopped. A grandson. My first grandson. A chance, not for forgiveness, perhaps not for redemption, but a chance for a different story to be written. A chance at a different legacy. A grandson. A life I had forfeited the right to know. A child whose face I might never see outside of a photograph, all because of the choices I had made. I wept through the night, curled up in my bed like a lost child. By morning, something had shifted. With swollen eyes and a sudden quiet resolve, I wrote a check for a substantial sum to the National Domestic Workers Alliance. Then I called my lawyer. I want you to begin the process of liquidating my assets. The penthouse, the Hamptons estate, the property in Aspen, and 50% of my shares in the company. He sputtered, clearly questioning my sanity. Mrs. Montgomery, are you sure you're in the right state of mind to be making such permanent decisions? It's not an impulse, I cut him off, my voice devoid of its usual impatience. It is the first truly sane decision I have made in years. When I told Charles about Claire's pregnancy, I braced myself for another look of disappointment. Instead, a slow, genuine smile spread across his face for the first time in months. I'm going to be a grandfather, he murmured, more to himself than to me. Then he looked at me, his expression turning serious again. Regina, I think it's time we signed the papers. I'm not angry anymore, and this isn't about punishment, but our marriage has been over for a very long time, and we both owe ourselves some honesty now. I nodded in silent agreement. He was right. We ended our 30-year partnership, not with a bang, but with a strange, clumsy hug, filled with the bittersweet ghosts of a shared lifetime. I hope you find peace, Regina, he said at the door. I truly do. 3 weeks later, sitting alone amid the skeletal remains of my living room as movers took the last of the furniture, I took the most difficult step of all. I took the final draft of the letter I had written to Luisa, rewrote it one last time, agonizing over every word, and finally sent it. I expected no reply. I included a desperate, heartfelt apology to both Claire and Philip, promising to respect whatever role, or lack thereof, they chose for me in their lives and the life of their child. Through my lawyer, I established a trust fund for my unborn grandson, with the clear stipulation that he would have access to it on his 18th birthday, regardless of any relationship with me. It wasn't a down payment on forgiveness. It was an acknowledgement of a debt. Nearly a month had passed since I sent the letter, and I had abandoned all hope of a response. Then, a short, direct email appeared in my inbox from an unfamiliar address. Regina, if you would still like to talk, I can meet you at the coffee shop across from Mount Sinai on Thursday at 3 p.m. Luisa. I must have read those few words 20 times, my heart pounding with disbelief. She was willing to see me. I spent the next 2 days rehearsing what I would say, what I would wear. For the first time in my adult life, I wanted to be invisible. I chose my simplest clothes, jeans, a plain t-shirt, flat shoes, no jewelry, minimal makeup. I arrived an hour early. My nerves shot. The cafe was a modest place, filled with the low hum of stressed families and tired hospital staff. I ordered a black coffee and waited. At 3 o'clock sharp, she walked in. She looked exactly the same. The simple bun, the neat but unassuming clothes, the quiet dignity that had so infuriated me on that terrible day. Our eyes met across the room, and I felt a hot flush of shame creep up my neck. She walked to my table without hesitation. Good afternoon, Regina. The conversation began in fits and starts, punctuated by long, awkward silences. I thanked her for coming. I asked about her health. Finally, I took a deep breath and said what I had come to say. Luisa, I know that no words can ever undo what I did, not just at the wedding, but for all those years. The way I treated you, the way I dismissed you after so much loyal service, the way I tried to erase you from my daughter's life. My voice cracked. She waited patiently as I composed myself. I'm not asking for your forgiveness because I haven't earned it. I needed you to know that I see the damage I caused, and I am trying to change. Luisa studied my face for a long moment before she spoke. You know, when I received your letter, my first instinct was to tear it up. My second was to read it and ignore it. It was something Philip said that changed my mind. She paused, her gaze drifting to a young family nearby, their faces etched with worry. He told me about his visit to you, and how he, too, had once been ashamed of where he came from. It made me think about how this country's obsession with class is a sickness that infects everyone, even the people it hurts. Her eyes met mine again. I'm not excusing what you did. It was cruel. But perhaps I understand its roots a little better now. After the waiter refilled our cups, she continued, Claire is doing well. So is the baby. They got married at City Hall. No party. Philip has accepted a position at a community health clinic in the Bronx. They're happy. Silent tears began to trace paths down my cheeks. I'm so glad to hear that. Thank you for telling me. She nodded. Then, to my astonishment, she reached into her purse, pulled out a small, grainy photograph, and slid it across the table. Your grandson. 16 weeks. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely pick it up. There he was, a black and white blur that was, in that moment, the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. Luisa, I started, my voice thick with emotion. Do you think someday that Claire might... I couldn't finish the sentence. She sighed, a long, weary sound. I can't make you any promises, Regina. Your daughter is deeply hurt, and she has every right to be. But the pause felt like an eternity. I told her I was meeting you today. I told her I was going to listen to what you had to say, and she didn't ask me not to come. It was the thinnest thread of hope, so fragile I was afraid to breathe on it. When the baby is born, she said, standing to leave, perhaps we can talk again. If this change you're talking about is real. I nodded vigorously, unable to speak. No promises, she said, pulling her coat on, but I will think about it. For the next 6 months, I held on to that single word, maybe. I liquidated almost everything, keeping only a modest 2-bedroom in Brooklyn Heights and enough to live on without the crushing weight of excess. What remained of my company was transformed into a foundation in my family's name, dedicated to providing college scholarships for the children of domestic workers. Twice a week, without fail, I went to therapy, excavating the demons of my childhood. I started volunteering at a local women's shelter, scrubbing floors and serving meals, tasks I once would have considered beneath me, now performed with a quiet, humbling focus. My therapist said I was trying to atone for my past. I knew no amount of good deeds could ever erase what I had done, but they helped to quiet the screaming in my own head. The call from Luisa came on a Sunday morning. He's here, was all she said. A healthy baby boy, 7 pounds. Mom and baby are doing well. I thanked her, my voice a whisper, not daring to ask for more. But she continued, Claire was wondering if you would like to meet your grandson. My heart stopped. When? I managed to breathe. Next Sunday. But Regina, there are conditions, she added, her tone firm but not unkind. It will be a brief visit at my house with all of us present. No extravagant gifts, no trying to control anything, and no expectations beyond this one meeting. I agreed instantly, dizzy with a gratitude I didn't deserve. And Regina, she said, using my first name for the first time, come dressed like a person, not like some Park Avenue socialite. They are taking this step for the baby, not because all is forgiven. The modest brick house in Astoria, Queens, was exactly as I had pictured it, impeccably clean, simply furnished, with lovingly tended plants on the small porch. I rang the bell with my heart in my throat, clutching a single, small teddy bear that fit in the palm of my hand. Philip answered the door. He was serious, but polite. Good afternoon, Regina. Please, come in. The living room was prepared for my visit. I recognized the signs of special effort in the simple bouquet of flowers on the coffee table, the porcelain cups reserved for important occasions. Claire was on the sofa, a tiny bundle in her arms. When she saw me, her expression was not one of anger or joy, but of a guarded neutrality, like someone observing a wild animal that might bolt. "Mother," she said with a nod. It was the first time she had called me that since the wedding, and the single word landed with the weight of a collapsing building. I approached slowly, as if any sudden movement might shatter the fragile peace. "Hello, darling," I replied, my voice hoarse. "Thank you for having me." Luisa emerged from the kitchen with a tray of coffee and homemade cake, her eyes assessing me, ensuring I was keeping my promise not to dominate the space. "Would you like to hold your grandson?" Claire asked suddenly, catching me completely off guard. I could only nod, my throat tight with unshed tears. She rose and, with infinite care, placed little Charles, they had named him after his grandfather, into my arms. It was the first time I had held a baby in decades. He was impossibly light, impossibly perfect. His eyes fluttered open for a moment, and he seemed to study me with the ancient, knowing gaze of a newborn before drifting back to sleep, utterly secure in the arms of the stranger who was his grandmother. I cried then, with no thought to appearances. These weren't tears of manipulation or performance. They were the overflow of a heart that was finally, painfully, beginning to relearn how to love without condition. The visit lasted exactly 1 hour. We spoke of trivial things, the birth, the sleepless nights, their plans for the future. We did not speak of the past. When Philip gently suggested the baby needed to rest, I handed Charles back to his mother and prepared to leave. At the door, Claire surprised me again. "We could do this again in a couple of weeks, if you'd like." I agreed immediately, my voice thick with emotion. Luisa walked me to the front gate. "That was a good start," she commented, as I waited for the Uber that had replaced my private driver. "But that's all it is. A start. This is a long road, Regina." I nodded, understanding completely. "I'm willing to walk it, for as long as it takes," I replied. "Not for me, for them, and for little Charles." As the car pulled away, I looked back at the simple house where a new, strange, and complicated family was beginning to take shape. I didn't know if I would ever be a true part of their lives, if my grandson would ever call me Grandma, or if they would ever see me as anything more than the sum of my monstrous mistakes. But for the first time in a very long time, I felt a sliver of peace. For years, I had everything money could buy, yet I lived in an emotional wasteland. Now, with almost nothing, I could just begin to see what truly mattered. My crime hadn't been just turning away a housekeeper at a church door. It was the lifetime I had spent denying her humanity, and in doing so, I had lost my own.